Yeah, well, I'll just push record on. I feel like, we're both
Yeah.
framed.
Oh yeah.
I have a very cute kitty
I'm
right here.
slightly off center. That's the way I like it.
Perfect. There you go.
Slightly
Nice.
left of center.
Perfect. Exactly.
The reason I thought media is an interesting topic is because I would propose that it is probably the least regulated industry in our current economy.
Yeah,
Like
it's so
because
new.
people are so gun shy about government regulation of media, like they do enjoy a lot of relative freedom. So it's an interesting, and are
Yeah,
still totally fucked. So
totally. And I guess I just don't know. The only reason I'm hesitant about getting into like a serious I don't feel like I've know that much about like the different factors at play that are determining
yeah,
what the policies are. Like, yeah, even with the laws going into place with Trump trying to protect these internet providers from or from censorship or however you want to interpret that.
yeah.
I feel like if I were to weigh in, it's going to sound very half baked. So I am happy to chat about that, but I feel like I
What's your opinion on the Huawei thing? Have we talked about that yet?
no.
Like the whole Huawei 5G, like Chinese government spying on you, like the whole package, conspiracy theories and all. Where do you lie?
Sorry, okay, I guess I don't know what Huawei stands for. That's the
Oh, sorry. Huawei is like the prominent Chinese cell phone developer that wants
okay.
to move into American markets, and the U.S. is talking seriously and in some cases taking legislative action to prevent them from accessing American markets because they cooperate with the Chinese government.
And I guess the
So
fear is
maybe,
that they're going to help the Chinese government spy through
yeah.
their
So the claim
infrastructure.
would be they're too closely tied to foreign. Whoa,
God damn it! I got a
that's a
cat
cat.
that's just like bored. I'm gonna put her out of my room. No, kitty, you can't do that. Thank you for. Okay, well, say hello. Say hello to
Glad we're
Tyson.
recording.
She's very cute. She's just the
Aw,
cutest kitty,
what's her name?
but she's like such a fucking troublemaker.
They say that cats have the least genetic markers for domestication of any animal that we live with.
I'm sorry, I had my headphones off, so I only heard domestication of any animal we
Oh,
live with.
they say that cats have the least markers for domestication of any animal that we keep as pets. Like they're
Yeah,
still the most wild.
yeah, that makes sense. I definitely get that impression.
Yeah.
And I like that. I honestly like living alongside cats and just trying to like mess with them and let them do their thing. It's a very entertaining relationship to have around.
Have you ever read about the toxoplasmosis thing?
Oh, where we smell their poop and love them or something?
Yeah, they carry this bacterium that makes other animals feel less threatened by them, is essentially it. And like they theorize that in the wild it's sort of adapted to rats so that like mice would be around cats but be less scared of them.
Right?
But
So,
like it infects humans too. And some people say that's part of why we find them so endearing.
huh,
They
interesting.
literally like use a
That's,
chemical weapon on us to.
yeah. And I've heard that before. I haven't like, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
It is very well established in rodents, to my understanding, but there's like a sort of fringe ideas that it has effects on humans as well.
Cool. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like having like outdoor cats for especially just having them like wild around me.
Oh
It
yeah.
always feels like a shame when these are my roommate's cats and they are indoor cats and they just seem like they're very pent up.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah, my buddy lives on a farm with like farm cats, and those are wild animals.
yeah,
Like,
that'd be sweet. I would love to do that.
yeah,
Okay, so yeah, the idea of like, well, basically in general, I feel like allowing foreign markets in. I don't like the idea of in principle not trusting a Chinese business because they could spy on behalf of the government. I
yeah,
yeah.
I agree.
So I mean, I think it could be possible, but feel like that's just a bit of a prejudicial approach. is
For
my
sure.
instinct.
Like nobody looks at Ericsson and is like, oh, like the Swedish and Norwegian governments are like going to spy on us and steal our important information. But for China, for some reason, we do.
Yeah, and I
Like,
definitely think we have a bit of a, well, obviously I'm concerned about China and see them as a very dangerous emerging power structure. I I feel like there's a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric that goes a little bit too far, where people are afraid of them making, like, they have a huge wealth creation right now over the last 20 years, and that's,
yeah,
I don't think that's concerning. I think that it's purely good. The fact that we're not purely good, but I think that's largely good. The fact that Chinese people are being pulled out of poverty and are just helping to grow the world
yeah.
economy all over the place.
I think China is poised to be like the first post-colonial state to actually be like a major player on the world stage, and that worries a lot of people.
Yeah, and just, like with any power structure, uh, yeah, you have a lot of ability to undermine human rights and things like that. Apparently,
Totally.
that's one of the things that undermined the Icelandic legal system, is that it was very functional, but uh, they ended up getting too much concentrations of power, and because of the nature of their legal system, it was very open to corruption because of that, and it broke down.
Yeah.
So
I
that's
find it interesting that basically every historical democracy in history that you could name, like it is widely accepted that it was hugely corrupt and there was mass breaches of power and all these things. Like when you study like Rome and Greece and things like that. But then like when you go to the last 30 years, suddenly attitudes change. You're like, no, we figured it all out. Like
yeah,
nothing bad's happening now.
yeah, it
Nixon
definitely,
was the last really bad president. They've been
yeah,
good.
totally, exactly. We're in this like completely removed society. Yeah, I it's really hard to approach, like, how do we break this trend of whenever we approach a large amount of wealth, it seems like, yeah, like the first step is we establish rule of law, predictable rule of law and property rights that facilitate and incentivize wealth creation en masse, and we create
Yeah.
this huge power structure that's built around the wealth, and then that power structure inevitably seems to get just
Yeah.
becomes a magnet to corrupt people. And
Well, it really is like the wedge thing you described. Like, I think most businesses, whether they should or not, want a small amount of like stability and like government. Like, they don't want anarchy in the streets because that's bad for business, right? Like, businessmen like a predictable environment that they can behave in, and that requires, historically at least, a certain amount of force to be levied. But then increasingly, it becomes like, I want to use that. Like, that power, once you create it, just becomes something that you're then attracted to, and it has this bad like spiraling relationship with wealth where they work together. And I think it happens in every government system. Like, it happened
yeah,
for sure in the days of lords and kings and war chiefs and all of that. Like,
absolutely. That's a big kind of point of this book that I'm reading, is that all these different legal structures throughout history have been perverted by these tiny little uh, like legal exceptions or wordings. One of
yeah,
the most interesting one is the Interstate Commerce Clause in the U.S. Have you heard about this?
I know the concept, but I don't know the controversy. No.
Just the degree to which the Interstate Commerce Clause has been perverted and reinterpreted by lawyers over the years to be just broadened so much that it's just insane what it applies to
Oh,
now.
like as a way for the federal government to get involved in things that they shouldn't
Yeah,
be involved in.
like
Yeah.
where, like a farmer who's growing crops on his own property to feed his own farm animals, he is subject to the Interstate Commerce Clause, because when he grows his own crops to feed his own animals, he's affecting the price of wheat in other states, presumably, because he's not buying it from other
Yeah.
states. And so therefore, he is engaging in interstate commerce when he's feeding his own animals, his own crops he grew on his own land. It's just so crazy.
I know.
And just,
It
yeah,
is like alarming, and like no, it's always like people always cheer the overreach of the federal government. I find like every single time in history when you look at like the federal government like exerting a lot of control and taking away states' rights and stuff, it is something that is praised publicly at all times in history, going all the way back to like the beginning of time. people
Yeah.
love it until it becomes like a nightmare, and then your society crumbles and there's not really time to dislike it. Like,
Yeah, and I think yeah, absolutely, because it starts with going after the outgroups, going after whoever's perceived as being
yeah.
that predatory group, like the Jews or whoever else, and they go after them first, and it's like, oh yay, the bad guys are getting, when in reality,
Mhm.
that's like always.
I think a big thing that has changed is that, like, because of the prevalence now of international law and an international community and all that, like previous in times of history when you had like deep strife, like what's going on in the US right now, if you went back 300 years, someone would look at that and be like, they're weak, like now's the time, and like
Yeah,
move in, right? And like Mexico, like China, whoever, Russia would have come in, and there would have been a new like stability achieved. There would have been a smaller state that federal government could then properly assert control over, and maybe like some exchange of land. And that's basically how it worked through all of history. But that doesn't happen anymore. So like things just get like way out of hand in a country. Like somewhere like Somalia, it's like, yeah, like there's nobody sweeping in to take control, and the people there can't do it themselves either. And so you just have anarchy basically facilitated by the international community.
oh man, I've been learning a bit about Somalia as well,
Oh
and
yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating. I feel like it pertains to two things you were just saying. First of all, I think the issue with Somalia is, well, there's two things going on where there's the pirates
Yeah.
off the coast, which are a very big problem, obviously, and they're attacking lots of people up and down the coastline, not just Somalians.
Yeah.
Then there's the warlords who are being funded by foreign governments from different places around there, and they're causing like little periods of civil war that are quite violent. But then
Yeah.
there's the actual like Somali communities, which are, they operate by what's called feud law, and it's a
Yeah.
fascinating system, and it's quite
I
pretty
was actually
functional.
reading about this week too. One of the big, oh, I can't think. I think it's David Friedman. Is that like the big libertarian guy?
Yeah, he's the one who wrote this book.
Okay, yeah. I watched a speech from him and then did a bunch of reading about like blood feud law and how it worked
Yeah,
as he was talking about it. It's kind of interesting.
and what I like about that is that, or not just feud law in particular, but a lot of these emergent legal systems. Damn it, I'm getting into the thing I want to talk about next week, but I'll just hint at
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Uh, is that where in a state legal system, the state apparatus is seen as removed from the general public, and it's not.
yeah,
It does not necessarily need to exist in the common culture and amongst the common people to be enforced and to be successful. Whereas in feud law or in lots of other legal structures, in order to work, it needs to be culturally uh, internalized into every single of all the members of the population. It needs to be absorbed and internalized, and because they are the enforcers ultimately. And for that reason, it seems like a much stronger system, in that if one person steps out of line, it's not just that their peers are like, hey, well, better not get caught smoking a joint. Their peers are going to come down on you for fear of the consequences that could accrue to them for not coming down on you.
yeah. Like it's like everyone is the sort of apparatus of the state,
Yeah,
rather than being like, watch out, or someone's going to call the cops.
absolutely. And so, like for instance, with like Roma culture or like Gypsy culture, there's this concept called marume, which is to be unclean. And if you engage in certain activities like sexually impure activities or other culturally taboo activities, you're seen as marume. Or if you break a law, you beat up another Roma, you're marume, and you're seen as
Yeah,
unclean, and you're sentenced to some sort of sentence. And if you don't abide, you're ejected from the community. And because they all culturally believe in this kind of state of being unclean, it's seen as very like a very bad thing. And if you
yeah,
become marame, your friends won't deal with you, your family won't deal with you, and you're left to deal with all of society who are all marame because none of them observe the traditions and the code. And so because it's such a culturally ingrained thing, gypsy culture, to the degree that they hold to these concepts, is very strong and very
mm-hmm.
self-enforcing. Recently, in the last few decades, they've moved away from this strict cultural adherence, and also they're seen as a bit predatory and just parasitic by outside communities because they often steal. They have no cultural norms against stealing from outsiders, so they're
Yeah.
often kind of, and so they've been declining in numbers. But uh, when you actually have the culture which believes in these customs, as it did for hundreds of years, it's extremely stable. And it's
Oh,
fascinating
absolutely.
how I think the wedge concept of creating these centralized bodies of power that can where like a legal precedent is much harder to wedge out if you have to affect the entire population, whereas if you all you have to do is appeal to certain political leaders through lobbyists and lawyers, then it's a much easier thing to do because all you have to do is
Absolutely.
raise enough money and you can affect change by just getting them to pass the interstate
For
commerce
sure.
clause and make them go after your opponents, whereas if you have to you have to convince the general public that this interstate commerce clause should be appealed or interpreted this way, it's never going to happen. So you can never convince all Amish people, for instance, and
Absolutely.
change Amish people in this way because they're much more of a anarchic community.
Hmm.
And in that
I
sense,
find
I
it
think.
interesting.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Like, sorry, did I go? You finish your thought.
Just the final thing I was going to say is I think in that way, those emergent legal structures are much more resistant to the slow degrade because they're, uh, yeah, they're so widely held by
Yeah,
necessity.
for sure. I had two things I was going to say. The first one, what I find really attractive about the feud system in the reading that I did is like often my principal criticism of market capitalism is that it fails to bring certain stakeholders to the table. And what the feud system really does is says like everyone is going to be affected somehow by this decision, some more than others. And as a community, like we're all involved. Like
Mm-hmm.
when you start saying like, you know, like the extreme cases where it's like your tribe's gonna like go to war against another tribe and stuff like that. Like everyone has to sit down and be like, is this really what we all want? And it's not just about like the two people who made the deal in the first place. It involves everyone in the community who will be peripherally affected, which I think is like a very good get. And I think something our current system also often fails to do because again, like functionally our legal system is always one-on-one. Like
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
class action suit, it's ultimately like this person we've chosen to represent us against your person you've chosen to represent you, as opposed to saying like sort of culturally, like we're all part of this decision and we all bear some blame and we all face some consequences for what's done.
yeah. It's cool that there's a few different solutions to that idea. I guess, are you describing like the Somali feud system when you say that? It sounds like that's what you're describing, where they're all part of like a clan or a tribe, and
Um,
your clan is held responsible for your actions, and
I believe so. I don't want to say specifically because
it sounds
like
like it. Yeah.
the readings I did didn't specifically use like Somali examples, but I think probably like I was reading more generally about like how blood feuds worked and
Okay.
how
Yeah.
that was
Cool.
like a thing that was done because we think of it like the way it's presented is cartoonified like everything else in our society, and it's like, oh, like, you know, I stole like this thing from their tribe and we've been killing each other for 400
Yeah.
years. That's not really how it happened. It was like much more like, you know, okay, something was done. If we don't all want to die and nobody on each side wants to fight, like we will work towards a peaceful resolution that
Yeah.
satisfies everybody.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons uh, that works so well is because people are part of clans and tribes. The like prisons sort of jump slightly, but prisons are a very interesting example of how feuds evolved out of simpler structures,
Yeah.
um, where you have these prisons in like the 1950s who they weren't that big in population, and you had kind of just an emergent prisoners code that was just called the code,
Yeah.
that you wouldn't rat on people, you'd be honest, you'd pay your debts, just basic kind of legal standards. And if you broke with
Mm-hmm.
those codes, then you just get ostracized, beat up, sometimes killed. And it was very, very standard and straightforward. And the problem was in the 60s and the 70s, apparently the populations of the prisons grew massively.
Yeah.
And the populations exceeded like Dunbar's number, which is the maximum number of people you can conceptualize in your brain. And so you're all of a sudden filled with a prison of anonymous faces, and you can no longer have the reputation and the
Yeah.
accountability that you had before. And that's when prison gangs emerged. And prison gangs, while very imperfect, functioned as a way to deal with this problem and create accountability where everyone had to be part of a gang, and if you wrong somebody, the gang is responsible. And so gangs come together as a feud system to mitigate risk, and they want to be able to sell their drugs and do other business, and they can't do that. There's a lockdown. And so they want to avoid any kind of large scale violence that would create a lockdown or other type of violence that's just costly. And so they had this very interesting system where you are expected to be part of a clan or tribe or a gang in this case, and their reputation is attached to you. And so it's this type of like, emergence. These structures emerge in order to compensate for Dunbar's number and the problems associated with that naturally. And it's fascinating how a lot of different versions of that solution have existed in different cultures, depending on restrictions, but they're all kind of very similar in that they're all variations on the feud system.
Well, exactly. Like we were talking about before, like people with money always need a power structure to create like stability. And so if you're operating in an extra legal space where it's like, we can't use the government because the government disapproves of the whole operation, you get exactly what you're describing. Like you have a gang and they'll say, okay, we'll make sure in this territory that we control, everybody follows the rules, everybody like honors bargains and stuff like that. And like in like La Cosa Nostra, for example, like they didn't actually do like directly like almost any crime. All they did was kill people and like provide safety for other people to do extra legal activities. And then like they were sort of aligned with, but not directly connected to drug dealers, like gambling rackets, things like that.
So in the what system were you, or what was the name you said of this one?
La Cosa Nostra, like the Italian mafia.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I didn't know that was the official name.
That's I think that's just like the mafia in Italian.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That's what they call themselves.
Cool. Yeah, no, it's fascinating how there's these, and the Somali system is pretty interesting in particular because they have a lot of social customs that are maybe a little off-putting, but there's just so many random interesting facts that I've learned in this book. Like
for sure,
you when you murder someone in Somalia, one of the ways in which they can be compensated is the family essentially sues through informal court systems for 100 camels if it's a man and 50 camels if it's a woman, and the camels have to be aged 3 to 6 and a female camel. It's just like such a funny like that's the standard currency for human life.
You can't measure human lives in money, so you got to use something else.
Yeah, I guess so. Exactly, that would be barbaric.
Yeah.
And apparently, if you kill someone and flee, then someone of equal status from your clan may be executed in their stead. Sometimes two, if the murder is egregious.
Yeah, I've heard of that in. Like a lot of the reading I was doing was like the sort of Middle East, like prior to the 20th century, like Middle East functioned under a very similar system.
Absolutely.
Stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and they would sometimes
like, like someone in your tribe stole from us, and it doesn't even really matter who. Like it really is like tribal units where
absolutely.
It's like no part of it is this individual needs to be killed. It's like someone in your tribe needs to be killed, or someone needs to give us money or whatever. And like the legal system really doesn't operate on individual units like ours does, which is very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, well, certainly it can be perceived as unfair, and it is in a sense, as long as as long as the individual parties are agreeing to this system, and it seems functional. It's interesting.
I think in a lot of societies, like in a Western society, it's so ingrained in us that like individual people are like the units of society, but in most societies that isn't the case. Like a lot of societies, it's family units or tribal units or whatever you want to do. Like very commonly until about 100 years ago, like a whole family, like your wife and your children kind of all operated in society through you. Like they didn't vote, they didn't really have rights that weren't extensions of your own.
Yeah, that's true.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and I'm still, as I say, making my way through this book and trying to make sense of a lot of these things, and it's really interesting. But like another example of that with the Somali vengeance killings is apparently some Ethiopian army officials wandered through, one Ethiopian army official happened to kill a Somali individual for not showing. He was accused of having uh, stolen goods, and he wouldn't show them the goods, so they killed him.
Yeah.
And then later, two army officials were casually walking through a village, and some peasants just casually walked up and murdered them. And then when the army came to figure out what had happened, they calmly explained, "Oh, we could have killed a lot more soldiers that day, but we killed these two because it was in accordance with their custom." And even though they had ample opportunity to kill the actual person who was responsible, they just killed the first two that they saw.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
from then on,
They don't see it as like, and in
yeah,
some ways, like that puts a stronger impetus on your group to self-police, right? Like,
absolutely. Well, after that happened, the Ethiopian government they enforced the policy of leave these people alone,
yeah,
because they have a very consistent, predictable policy that we can just avoid and we'll never get into trouble. It's only if you have this kind of unpredictable, we don't know when we're going to get attacked, there's
yeah,
insecurity, then we're going to attack you because we don't feel safe. But you feel safe around a predictable policy like that. So
for sure. And again, like I said, like what people really want is stability. Like,
absolutely.
you know, when you talk to people who live in like authoritarian states and stuff like that, at least, I shouldn't say this is generally the case, but in my experience, when you talk to people who have immigrated here from like Iran or China or whatever, they say like, you know, if the stores are open and the trains run on time, like that's what people really care about. Like
Yeah,
having a theoretically better government that's incapable of like maintaining order isn't as attractive to people as having like, you know, whatever. And really, like for the majority of people, it doesn't, your life isn't different. Like, you know,
absolutely. Yeah,
if you're like a farmer in Ukraine versus a farmer in China, even though you're halfway across the world, like your life isn't isn't that different
yeah. Do
at the
you
end
have
of
a
the day.
buyer?
Yeah, exactly. You grow, like most of your life is doing the personal shit that has nothing to do with your government.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I mean, oh man, I feel like this
Yeah, yeah.
is so
Okay,
tempting to
let's
just
change
get into all.
subject.
I mean, I would love to just read more about
Yeah,
this and try to, because it's just so fascinating. I'm trying to like
it is.
I'm trying to like make sure I understand the exact differences between like for instance, there's three different parts of the Romanov culture, and they all have a different version of the feud system. And some of
The
them
money
only
culture.
practice ostracism, and some of them practice honor killings. It's very,
Yeah.
oh my God. It's a lot to take in.
Okay. Let's switch subjects before we burn through all of our good anecdotes.
Well, I want to almost like just kind of honestly, I'd like to, when we do a talk on this, probably cover some of the same material anyway, if that's
Yeah.
okay. So I don't know what today's video will be. Maybe I'll just edit out certain bits and
No, for sure. Me
yeah,
too. Like, it's a very interesting topic. Anything when you study like the historical examples, it's fascinating to see what is the same everywhere and what is different everywhere.
yeah,
And
totally,
like, you know, like kind of to see like what is just our built-in behavior and what is just like, you know, hard-rooted cultural behavior that could be completely different down the road.
yeah. There's like certain ingenious solutions to certain problems that existed presumably only in certain areas. Like there's two examples that I'm not going to cover today that I know
Yeah.
you in particular will find fascinating, of just different solutions to problems that you have mentioned.
Yeah.
And one by the Icelandic system, and one by the Somali system. But I don't want to get into them because I think they're a perfect thing to save for the actual talk. But oh man, it's such a fascinating
Yeah,
thing, comparative study of historical examples.
for sure. One of my favorite like historical differences. So if you look at like like the American society, like people don't realize this, but American peoples didn't have the wheel. Like they did not develop the technology of the wheel to be used the way we used it in Europe.
Well, actually,
And they didn't develop animal husbandry. That was the other one. Like they didn't largely like develop like domestication of animals. It happened on very small scales in like the super advanced Mesoamerican societies, but like largely they didn't keep animals. And like
yeah,
just with those two small differences, they go in like radically different directions. And
yeah,
like another one is like obsidian. Like you see like the Native American warriors, they always have like the weird clubs with like the obsidian blades and stuff on them. So because they had obsidian and it was just so much better than like European metalwork, like the available metalworking, like it created sharper, stronger, more powerful weaponry. They didn't develop like steel. because like they had
Yeah.
obsidian that was better. But then like over time, like steel created all of these other things that like didn't get created in the Americas because like they had obsidian.
Oh
And they
man.
have like these weird like, you know, super high tech like razor blade clubs, but then they show up with like a cannon and they have nothing to fight back against it with, right? Like,
Yeah, early American, Native American history is something that I'm so fascinated with. Actually,
very
apparently,
interesting.
they did develop the wheel in very isolated cases. They had children's toys with wheels in
Yeah,
Mesoamerica,
yeah. Like
but
certainly
they
they had like circles, but the idea of like the wheel as a simple machine that makes labor easier, they
yeah
did
they
not
ne-
like
I
develop
get
that technology.
yeah one guess for why they were used in children's toys like children's wheelbarrows but never used for carts is because the areas in which they were invented and used were very
Yeah.
hilly, and because they're so hilly and like covered in stairs on the sides of mountains, presumably they wouldn't be very useful. They're relative to yeah like a
Hmm.
flat surface like cobblestone streets, but
Totally.
it's fascinating that that was never
It is fascinating. So like
even
when you look at like the like Native American pyramids that we built here, they're built with completely like floor to ceiling different technologies than the Egyptian pyramids, even though like the end effect is very similar. Like it is radically
yeah.
different from beginning to end how they were built.
Oh man, deep history is so
Yeah.
cool, and I love how, especially in this Western Hemisphere, in the New World, we're now
Yeah.
discovering that we have civilizations that went back way before we thought they did. We used to think that
Oh yeah.
12,000 years ago was the arrival of these Native American cultures, like during the Clovis period. Now
Totally.
we're finding like 50,000 years and beyond is there's remnants.
Well,
It's
there's
crazy.
growing evidence that it was actually colonized in two waves. So
Yeah,
like we had like the people coming across the Bering Strait up north, and then you also had Polynesians that came across, sort of island hopping and landed in the south.
absolutely. Yeah.
And there may be like a mixed genetic population derived from both of those sources.
Yeah, and there's a lot of genetic evidence for that idea. In that, presumably, they came over the ice, whatever it's called, the Bering
Bering
Strait,
Strait. Yeah.
and then one population went north and was cut off, and one population went south, and those became slightly genetically different, but they're very similar. And then both those groups are genetically different from the southern population, which is um,
Yeah.
so yeah, presumably
Fascinating.
the north and south are came over together and then are a little bit
Mhm.
different, and then but they branched off from the Aztec population much earlier, somewhere off in another continent.
Absolutely. The unfortunate thing is that there's so little, especially in South America, there's so little like Aboriginal genetic material left in the population that it's really
Yeah,
hard to research those things.
it's all been like
A
yeah,
lot like the Taino people, like the people that inhabited the Caribbean, are like literally extinct. Like there's no living descendants of them. Like when the first colonizers came here, they just killed all of them.
yeah. I didn't know that. Yeah,
Yeah, it's terrible. But like it's just fascinating that like we won't know. Like you can't do a genetic
yeah.
analysis on that. There is no surviving genetic material.
Oh man, it is a fascinating just
Morbidly
practice.
fascinating, but fascinating. Yeah.
Just this the practice of trying to look really far back, like really far back. It's just it's so cool what we can kind of start to, at least in the last 20 years apparently we've obviously because you're referencing a lot of the information, we've learned so much about this hemisphere in the last 20 years or so.
Totally.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Apparently there's strong evidence that the Amazon rainforest was planted as a giant uh, garden for fruit.
Yeah. Lots of forests here. Like they tell like the old stories that Europeans came here and they're like, oh, like it was such a bountiful like landscape. Like you just walk through the forest and there's like fruit everywhere.
Yeah.
And like you're like, no, like they did.
God made this for us. Native
Look
Americans
at
were
all
like
these blueberry bushes along this path. Like what?
yeah, it's so funny.
Reading like if you ever get a chance to read like real historical accounts from like 500 years ago, it's just fascinating to see how different people's attitudes towards everything is. Like
Yeah.
as much as we like to think like, oh, like 500 years ago people were just like, no, they were nothing like us, like completely culturally detached.
Yeah, I've never read first-hand accounts, but
Yeah,
I've read lots of
they're
material that
interesting.
directly references the source material with quotes and whatnot. So I vaguely
Like when you read like Captain Cook and like stuff like that, like he lands on an island and he's literally just writing about like, I'm just gonna like conquer these people while I'm here, because why not? Like we're
Fuck
stopping
it.
here for a week. Why wouldn't we? Like
Yeah.
you're like, oh, that's bizarre. And then you just leave. Like it's not like you're like, oh, we're gonna build like a settlement here. No, we'll subjugate them on our way through. Kill their king or whatever, and then just leave a mess behind while we move on to the next island.
Yeah, just murder a bunch of people, proving us.
Quite literally, they write casually about doing stuff like that. Same with Columbus. Like if you read Columbus's journals, he's just like, yeah, like I'm just gonna enslave a bunch of them. Like we can. Why wouldn't we?
Yeah, I mean it'll add to our status and honor.
Yeah, like when you talk like casually as he talks about other treasures and curiosities he's going to bring back from the Americas, he talks about bringing back slaves. Like he's like, I'll bring like fruits, like gold, samples of like these seashells I found, some slaves, like this cool wood that was growing here. Like,
Wait, what was that last thing? I feel like
yeah,
you skipped
exactly.
one. Yeah, it's a different time. I'm just gonna close my blind here. Maybe this is too dark. This is probably way too dark in my room now. I don't know. Oh wow, actually this is not too dark. How am I still? I'm even brighter. No.
Yeah, man.
What's happening? I just need to.
Clearly, like your makeup team needs work. Like
Yeah, I need to invest in a better makeup team and just some natural. I need to invest in some non-natural lighting that looks half decent. I'm sure I can pick up a lamp with just like the right bulb for like $20.
So I did want to talk about media because you've been posting a lot about media this week.
Sure.
And I'm just like, so to put like 3 framing questions, like how would you characterize the current system that we have? What do you think are like the flaws or issues, if any, in how the system we have works? And how, if possible, would you fix them?
Okay. So I think the current system we have now seems to be largely a system where regulation takes place by private companies with some degree of pressure from the government to protect people's to protect against defamation and other basic things like that, is my understanding.
Sure.
And
like libel laws and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so companies like YouTube and Facebook have pressure put on them by governments to remove things like relating to that and other things relating to hate speech and whatnot.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think honestly, I'm probably a big believer in the idea of a much more Wild West version of the internet, where unless it's a direct call to violence, I'm not going to have an issue with it.
I agree. I would controversially say that I don't believe in hate speech laws. Like,
yeah, me neither.
As long as I can understand like a direct call to action. Like if you are saying like tonight at midnight we're gonna go out and lynch people, like that is action and not really speech at that point. But like even saying like I'm not gonna say some horrid thing that someone can clip me saying, but like going out and espousing some sort of hateful speech. Like the best thing that I think can happen is that people go out and say that and are ridiculed and like very in a public space confronted, rather than being pushed into a private space where they won't be confronted.
Yeah, absolutely. Or I think we give away the moral high ground if we approach a non-violent act with ultimately threats of violence or threats of physical removal.
But even just like I totally agree with that. But even just from like a purely like ends driven, like I don't think it's effective. I think you create bubbles of people who all feel the same. Whereas if you let them into the public space, they're forced to deal with other people. Like
it's true.
The classic example that's like, grandpa was super racist until he met a black friend at the country club, and then like it changes his whole attitude towards it, right? And like when you start saying like we're gonna push all the racist people out of these spaces, then they don't have those experiences and they don't change. They get forced into a space that's only racists, and then there's nothing to challenge those ideas. And racist, sexist, like homophobic, like pick your adjective.
Totally. Yeah, so I think we probably agree on that part. And I think the issue I see with social media is that it changes the types of relationships that take place in ways that I don't think we really fully understand yet. And I'm not sure,
For sure.
I don't think I understand really what's going on.
I don't think
Obviously, it's been made
anyone.
more
Yeah.
impersonal. I see things like, even just like yesterday with this recent post I had, I see people who I know are like very respectful people say things to other people that they don't know, uh, that they would never say in person, that are like
Absolutely.
so cutting and cruel and just like, whoa. I just, and I think that's unhealthy because I
I
think,
agree. I think the dialogue becomes very different. Like the dialogue people have with strange, like it's almost about like wanting to get that zinger or like, ha, got him, rather than like a real discussion. You know what I mean? And a lot of it is signaling to other people like, I am on our side and I'm good at doing this. Like,
yeah, absolutely. And I remember I read this book called On Killing, and it described how the more we've distanced ourselves from the act of killing, the easier it is to do. And that's largely a bad thing. Like as we look at the history of wars, a lot of it is a history of making killing more impersonal. We go from like stabbing someone with a bayonet to killing them from a distance with a gun, and then a sniper rifle, and then we're bombing them from a plane, or pushing a button on a drone strike with a little blinking light that's going towards the target. And when it becomes so impersonal,
yeah,
we don't have to face the psychological reality of taking a human life. And the psychological aversion to doing that is an important thing and shouldn't be overcome so easily. And I think the same thing is happening here, where there's an aversion to basically being rude, being a jackass, being like trying to cut someone down a peg or two. There's an aversion to that that I think is healthy. And I think when we have a conversation through the internet, a lot of those are removed. And I think that's, in my mind, one of the biggest issues with internet. And especially it comes up when you interact with strangers. You have no expectation of interacting with them in the future. And I don't know what the
absolutely.
best solution to that is, but
Well, and even like, and obviously the internet is the biggest community, but like just when you participate in a large community, like relationships seem more optional. You know, like if you look at like a workplace, people won't talk like that because it's like I
yeah,
have to be tolerable with this guy. I can't like call him a racist and like make fun of his mom like in a meeting on the fly because like I might need something from him later.
yeah,
And certain same thing in like a family structure or any sort of like small microcosm of community. But in the large expanse, even in a city like, and Calgary is a small city, but in a city of 1 million people, like you can piss someone off every day for the rest of your life and still have tons of friends left over, right? Like
yeah.
it just makes those relationships so optional. I don't think humans are really wired for gigantic communities the way we live in now.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think there could be a small silver lining in that people are a little bit braver with expressing what they believe to be true on the internet when they feel like they're protected by anonymity. So maybe there's some benefit in the fact that we're more candid, but I think it needs to be tempered with maybe more of a culture of respect on the internet. Because maybe that's the solution, is we need to develop a standard where we say that we like, it's not cool to talk to strangers this way. Like it's not cool to make an ownage video and take someone down. And that's
So, how do you feel? And obviously, like I think we both probably have strong feelings. Do you think there is any good that is done by like things like public shaming or like people getting someone fired because of something they said online and things of this nature? Like certainly there are bad cases, but are there cases where it's like the justice system is failing and like mob rule accomplishes something that wouldn't otherwise be done and
for
perhaps
the
discourages bad behaviors?
like for the idea of getting someone fired, unless what they put on display relates directly to their job. Like if they're a bus driver and we have a video of them driving drunk or something.
Yeah.
In that case, yeah, I think maybe the what we learn is relevant and should be maybe used to get that person fired. But in the vast majority of cases, I think that's a very inappropriate response. I do think public shaming can be a useful thing. I think a lot of times when there's uh, externalities, negative externalities that are very difficult to pin down and kind of define exactly when they've gone wrong, a lot of times more serious responses are inappropriate. Or like, for instance, if someone's polluting, I think responding with violence is a very dangerous way of approaching it. So in that case, I think social ostracism and shaming is it's a softer approach. And I think I think especially with pollution, things like that, I think shaming is a very good solution.
I think it's sort of like these are very natural responses that we used to do through our established legal system. Like if you go to tort law in England like 400 years ago, like it was very common to say, okay, like we'll put you in the stocks in the middle of town and everyone will make fun of you, or stuff like that. But like these are punishments that can't actually be doled out by our legal system. Like you can't have a judge say, I'm going to fire you from your job. Like that's the punishment for what you've done. You can't have a judge say, I'm going to humiliate you. Some states do that. Like in California, maybe about 10 years ago, there was like the famous things where they were making people wear signs that said like, I stole or whatever. Do you remember that?
No.
I'd have to look it up. But this was like a thing. Like basically the judge, it was like a public shaming thing. So like you catch people like shoplifting and stuff like that. And he's like, rather than like a fine or a night in jail, I'm going to make you wear a sandwich board on the side of this highway that says I stole, and all your friends will see that you did it, right?
That's funny. Okay.
But generally we don't do things like that in our society. And ironically, it's something we got rid of because we felt it was like a heinous and like inappropriate punishment. And now it's coming back in like a more public place. But maybe the better solution is to say like a court can do something like that. Like an actual jury of your peers can dole out these sort of minor punishments that are less violent and more effective. Like that's what I think is the good value, is like rather than like arresting somebody, you just humiliate them.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think a lot of times that's enough. And
so like, I'm going to share an anecdotal story that I cannot back up because I was told by somebody, but I have not verified it. But in some Native American societies, there was this culturally held practice where you would carry around like a small pouch of like these very private, like mementos and things like that. So like, it'd be like something like a lock of your wife's hair or like a childhood toy, things like that. And when people feuded, they would basically like open your pouch and spill it out. Rather than fighting, they'd kind of spill out all your stuff and it would embarrass you because it was like this bag full of embarrassing crap that you carried around. And like that was how they that was like an early historical example of like public shaming. Like it was basically like rather than two guys beating the shit out of each other, you spill out your bag of embarrassing memories and everyone makes fun of you, and then it's kind of resolved that way in a non-violent space, as opposed to like, you know, what was also common in Native American societies, which was that they would just kill each other, like, you know, blood feuding and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that because obviously I come at it from a perspective where I believe the law should be enforced by individuals and
totally
kind of commonly held in society anyway. Generally, I absolutely nonviolent if possible and through ostracism. But so I technically I wouldn't think that enforcing this through a court system would be superior, but I do think that there's a huge benefit in doing it. I mean, certainly through like a decentralized court system, like the ones that we're describing in
one of those libertarian court systems.
Yeah,
it's the same. But yeah, I did watch quite a bit about market law, and it was pretty interesting. Although, anyway, we won't get into it. But I have some criticisms.
This is the thing. We need to do that video so that we can come back and like reference it, and then we can talk.
Well, that's kind of why I wanted to get into media, because I was like, this is like a pretty big thing that we haven't really talked about, and like a lot of libertarians have issues with the media, but like don't have. To my mind, there isn't really a solution to the problems of media, and most of the problems are brought about by the market, rather than like the state, which makes it kind of an interesting topic to discuss, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's a very abusable situation where you can have various players who just create these astroturf organizations, I guess the fake grassroots movements, and they create momentum in a way that's totally illegitimate. And I absolutely agree. It's a tricky thing to approach. I think if anything, we just need to create a culture that stresses the importance of a better type of online interaction. But
Totally.
I'm not sure
I
what
think
that
we
looks like.
need to change our relationship. Like a big thing that I think is the problem, and this is kind of what I wanted to get into with like the idea of like expert culture. Like we increasingly have this idea that like the only legitimate information is something that is disseminated through a major news outlet. That
Yeah,
like and not necessarily badly, but like there's very much a cultural idea that like something that your friends told you about a company is complete horseshit compared to like a CNN expose on that same company.
yeah.
And like that creates an environment where the media can very much control discourse, not only through like what they say, but what they choose to report on and not to report on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can be a good thing because I think creating established sources of truth that people trust is just like a way of, it's like a shorthand way of saving time. Like we can't have everyone going to
Yeah.
source information. So we need to have like the established outlets that we trust. Personally, I think a better solution to that would be to trust individual people rather than institutions, because institutions, I think, are a lot harder to you don't have as much, I think, consistency within institutions. Like, for instance, CNN can have one reporter that's putting out very good information, but you can also have one reporter that's very just.
Yeah,
I
and they
guess,
kind of all get judged by the CNN banner. You never hear people saying like, "Oh, like I don't like this one news correspondent. I think the things they say are poorly researched." Like people talk about the whole station, right?
yeah, and a lot of times when CNN puts out some bad information, it doesn't necessarily change anything. People still trust CNN pretty much to the same degree because they still see it as a generally reputable source. Whereas if you have an individual, I don't know, I just like to point to like when I learn about economics, I can point to this dude. I learned it from him, therefore I believe it to be true, and it seems a little bit more predictable for myself.
I just think, to me, I agree with all that. I would go one step further and say what we should actually be doing is say like, I read this study. Like the methodology seems really good to me. Like I like the approach that they took because like when you filter, because even the authors you hear about, ultimately that's filtered through a publisher, that's filtered through like levels, which bookstores are choosing to stock it, which news outlets are choosing to report it. And it's much better if we could say like, okay, here's like the actual study, here's how the data was like, and not necessarily that everyone needs to be like a genius, but like some pretty low level stuff. Like here's, you know, let's look at how many people were studied in this experiment. Let's look at how they chose their sample. Let's look at like the rough methodology of how they analyze the data. And I believe most people are capable of that if they try to do it, and it will lead to a better discourse.
I absolutely agree with you. I think the problem is that people are always trying to economize on time, and
For sure.
we don't have enough time, I think, to really look at every article. And
So all I would say to that then is that, and I agree with that 100%, and that's like a major concern, but I don't think because of that we should say that placing faith in an expert or a news outlet is an effective substitute for really being informed.
yeah,
Like to me,
absolutely.
the solution is that if you aren't willing to take the time to do it, and nobody's going to take the time to study everything, but if you say like, okay, I just can't be bothered to read like a journal, one or two journal entries a month about climate change, then I'm not going to go around saying that I have an informed opinion because one time I read an article by this guy 3 years ago and it sounded legit. Like,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. I think a big part of it, the problem for me, I think it's the fact that democracy tells people that they need to have an opinion on everything.
yes.
Personally, I don't believe that state democracy is a functional system. I would prefer more of an emergent structure. And I don't think the average person should be expected or pressured to weigh in on everything or even anything if they don't feel comfortable doing so.
Mm-hmm.
And just even in principle, the idea that I have the right to vote on other people's rights of which I know nothing about, or of a circumstance of which I know nothing about, seems very strange to me. And I think we're kind of just pressured, especially around election time. We're pressured to everyone weigh in, everyone have an opinion, everyone kind of say what's like, and I think it's a very, I think it's dangerous. I think it's a bad a bad environment because it encourages everyone to, as you say, just concoct this opinion, and they have to
Well,
appeal to
and
the
really,
experts.
really the end result is tribalism. That you say like the people around me that agree with me seem to like these guys, so I'm gonna
Yeah,
represent them too.
I'm
Like
pressured to
every
have
time
an
I see
opinion.
someone post something that's like 5,000 climate change experts agree, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, I bet you can't name one of them. I bet you lack like a basic understanding. And that's not to say like there's tons of bullshit on both sides of the climate
Yeah,
change issue. But like people going around pretending they're informed when they don't have a fucking clue how any of it works is just the problem.
yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
yeah,
I think we are pressured to present
totally.
ourselves as experts when we're
Because as a
not.
society, we don't accept a non-opinion. Like,
Yeah,
it
it's
is,
true.
I would say most people would find it like more off-putting for someone to say like I don't have an opinion on climate change. Like I'm
Yeah,
not informed enough to really say one way or the other. People would be like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like if you're not reading that shit, you should just be here by default. Like
absolutely. I do find it very odd that yeah, we are. Yeah, like I've during election time, I've asked my friends who are like, get out there and just vote on something, just try to learn anything, and just and like,
yeah,
and I've asked them, do you think it's better for me to have an uninformed opinion where I know nothing, to add my voice to the mix, even though I might
yeah.
just, I'm adding less informed knowledge to like, presumably
You're
people might know what
watering
they're
it
talking
down
about.
is
Yeah,
ultimately what
exactly. You're
you're
watering
watering
down,
down the discussion.
absolutely. And people get really mad at people because I don't think they're willing to acknowledge that. I think because they believe, as it's been said so many times before, that democracy is not the best system, but it's better than all the others, or whatever the quote is.
Yeah.
They think that therefore we need to accept it with all of its warts and all, including these perverted incentive structures that create
Yeah.
just expert culture where there's no expertise.
Well, and like it's amazing to me in a democracy how quickly people are willing to accept like the system's broken and it'll never be fixed. Like how readily people are like everyone agrees that the electoral college
Yeah,
is complete nonsense, but like whatever, it's never gonna get fixed.
yeah,
Like
and
and it's like okay, so then what you're really saying is like I live in a flawed democracy that's really run by like essentially I believe we live in like an oligarchy type situation. Like we really do have a ruling class that makes decisions and decides amongst themselves what
yeah,
happens. And like while people are allowed to play a little bit, like largely it's functionally the same as like the House of Lords was in England, that as long as you don't completely upset the populace to the point where they do something radical, like you're free to do whatever you want.
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's it's wild. It's I don't, it's just
Yeah.
it's funny how people will acknowledge that the system is so corrupt, but then they still view it as necessary to
No.
do what's
The
pragmatically
two-party
necessary in
voting
the
people in the
moment.
United States, like the whole we have to vote for Biden or else. And I'm like,
Yeah,
no, like now is the time. Like if you
yeah.
want to get a third party into US politics, now is your
Oh
chance.
my
The
God, if
two
there ever was a
shittiest
time.
candidates in the history of your country.
Yeah,
Like now is the time for Joe Jorgensen or who's the Green Party guy? Harry Hawkins, is that his name?
I'm not sure. Yeah,
Yeah, like whoever your third party person you support, like now is your chance. Get them in there, make it happen. Like,
yeah,
and
it's
instead
wild.
people are like, no, like I forget the third party thing. Like I'm gonna
Yeah,
vote for Biden.
it's such a mental throughway where people just naturally say, but you have to, we have to choose one of them. We have to.
Like how in the midst of a crisis of police brutality and like defunding the police is a cop the vice president of the Democratic Party. Like
And not
the
just a
Progressive
cop.
Party is like, yeah, double down on police brutality, like commitments to raise police funding by billions of dollars across the country. Like this is the way we're going.
And not
And the
just like a
far right is
cop,
like
like,
absolute authoritarian fascism. This is our
yeah,
classy,
oh my
like
God.
abducting people in unmarked vans. Like that's what we're going for. And people are like, wow, better to have police
Yeah,
brutality. Like,
well, you got to choose one of these.
yeah.
It's yeah, it's so twisted. I feel like it's amazing the degree to which elections prevent people from properly representing themselves and properly
Yes.
putting in place a representative system.
It's amazing how easily people game democracy. Like how
Yeah,
quickly, and again, like throughout history, it's always been that way. Like you read about like Rome, and it was exactly the same shit. People are talking about the exact same problems, the exact same issues, the exact same, like, I'm going to vote for this party against that party rather than actually voting my interests. Like, it's as old as time. And it
Yeah.
really doesn't get better. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a tricky one to approach because people definitely have a very ingrained belief that democracy is, despite its imperfections, they're very resistant to exploring alternatives, and I think
for
that's a
sure.
big I think there's a few concepts that are very widely held in society that I think if we're going to make any real headway, we need to address them directly and try to
Totally.
push a movement that acknowledges the just incredibly corrupt nature of those concepts. And I think state democracy is one of those, and it's very hard to start that conversation with a lot of
Exactly.
people.
Just like generally, like, be willing to have difficult discussions with people. Like, I think a big thing that needs to change in our society is like the whole don't talk about politics and religion at the dinner table type attitude,
Yeah,
right? Like, it's rude to discuss your politics with people. It's like, no, like, that's what makes democracy work, is people talking about shit and like making it happen. And it's painful and it's rough. And sometimes you gotta like really brawl with people, but like that's what makes it function.
absolutely. And I mean, I would go so far as to say that's what makes any functional political
Absolutely.
system or any society
Yeah,
function, whether it be a feud system or whatever, is people need to be
exactly. People
abreast.
getting out there and advocating for themselves.
Yeah, and they need to know what's going on in their society and the trends and the
Totally.
emerging structures and precedents. And they,
Yeah.
yeah, it's seen as just rude to pry.
Yeah. Like, it drives me crazy. Like, and it's like, I think you're kind of the same type of person. Like, all I want to talk about is that stuff.
Yeah,
Like, I
absolutely.
don't care like that you shot 83 at some golf course yesterday. Like, I want to talk about your politics. Like,
Yeah.
I want to really get into it. Like,
Yeah, no, I think it's even, yeah, I love it. Even
yeah,
if it's not going anywhere, I think it's just fascinating.
totally. But that's like the tribalism too, because like when people very openly espouse like, if you voted for Donald Trump, you're like a racist piece of shit, like scum of society, and I want nothing to do with you. So then it's like, okay, don't mention it if you talk to Trump, because like it'll make it a very uncomfortable conversation. Like,
Yeah, oh man. I had like, yeah, I've definitely had that the reverse, where
yeah,
I was friends with somebody. I'm still friends with them, but they basically made a statement about like, oh, this person believes this, and they're like a horrible person. I think they should be like essentially never
yeah,
employed by anyone. I'm like, oh, I agree with that.
and
And
it's
then they
like,
were
well,
like, oh, and they were in
I
this
know, right?
hilarious awkward position where they had to
They
like,
don't mean it. Like, they don't actually mean it when they're saying that. They're just like signaling, really. Like,
yeah,
they're signaling to people around them, like, I am really dedicated to this group. Like,
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it was shown that they didn't have a huge problem with me at all, especially when I was
totally.
like very like chill and candid and be like, oh, well, this is why I believe that. They're like, oh, okay. But anyway, I hate other people who believe that. It's like, okay.
I think like ultimately when you dig down to it, I think most people like identify the same problems and have the same issues and just have different approaches. Like,
Yeah,
the fundamental difference between like authoritarianism and libertarianism is like, the system we have is broken. There is corruption in our government. Is the best way to do that to have more oversight, or is it to have less government? Like,
yeah,
if you have a bad thing, do you depower it or do you try to fix it? And those are like the fundamental two approaches in our society, right? Like,
yeah, for sure. And yeah, my train of thought. Oh no, it's gone. It's okay. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
or like, like there's fundamental disagreements, but I think part of the discussion, like part of my goal is always like, okay, what is like the fundamental, like there'll be some point sometimes where you're like, okay, like we just disagree on this. Like,
yeah.
and
Oh,
often that's not something you can just immediately get past in a 10-minute conversation. But even getting there to be like, okay, because you believe that, I get how you're extrapolating to all these other things.
yeah,
Like, as opposed to just being like, how do they believe that? Like, they're fucking on crazy pills. Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Uh, I just remembered. Is it okay if I interview you one of these times where I just literally ask you a series of like 100 questions as part of another project I want to do? Where I think I've told you about this. Where I have this belief that the vast majority of humans on this planet hold to this basic human ethics, and
Yeah.
we just use different terminology. And while there are a few, I call them derailing beliefs, where if you believe them, you are going to create conflict in society no matter what. There's a few of those, but they're
Yeah.
hugely few and far between relative to the brunt of what people presumably disagree about, which is nothing.
Totally. Yeah, I'm totally okay with that.
Sweet.
Did you end up getting any of those videos up? I know you said you were going to try to get them for today.
No, I've been trying to make the channel work. I don't know what's going on. And I think also my brother, he works with Blender a lot, and he's going to make a little intro for me. With just like the name of the channel and like a little like graphic.
Gotta have
like...
your intros like Raid Shadow Legends, like
exactly. Yeah. Lightning bolt.
If you sign up now, you get like 25 free credits or whatever.
Exactly.
Use
And
the
you
code
get
below.
the in-channel currency only usable.
NordVPN, Audible, all the usual suspects.
Yeah, like. We have links provided. Don't worry about it. Yeah, and so I'm gonna. I don't have it up yet, but So I failed. I failed at my personal goal, but I will. I'm gonna get that up soon.
What do you think are some examples of like fundamental destabilizing beliefs? Or was that the word you used?
Derailing beliefs.
Derailing beliefs.
Yeah, like if you if you believe something fundamental that's wrong about reality, this is an easy example, but if you believe that there's nothing wrong with polluting the environment, like if you believe that like lead isn't poisonous or something crazy like that.
That's fair.
There's a lot more subtle.
But that's more of like misinformation than like a belief, I would say. Like that's more of like a
Sure.
Those are educational issues, perhaps.
I think a lot of the feuds, like based around, like in the Middle East around religion, I think maybe are an easy example where if some group believes that they are like religiously entitled to some land, and whoever were the previous inhabitants, because they're not the chosen people, are not, that could be like and just stuff like that. And so in those cases, I think it's necessary to address the sources of those beliefs and what is causing them.
So without getting into like a super dangerous area, I'm curious, because you believe so much in like normative, like cultural beliefs as like a solution to a lot of our problems, right? Like this idea that like as a culture, we need to sort of, so like I would argue that historically until about 200 or 300 years ago, like religion served that purpose, at least in European societies. Like the sort of base underlying point was like, we all agree on the Bible or whatever. Maybe in your society it's the Quran or etc. But do you think that religion can play that role in society? Go ahead.
Yeah, this is actually a fascinating conversation that I'd love to do even a separate talk on. Just the historical function that religion has played in not just protecting moral precedents, but moving them forward. And I absolutely agree. And this is something I've come to believe much more in the last few years, is that like religion isn't required to make you a good person, but it sure doesn't hurt a lot of the time. And having these kind of having these systematized belief systems where it's all written down and everyone, because a lot of people, they're not willing to really individuate and read books about like radical philosophy and develop their own belief structure. They just want to like adopt whatever's around them. And a lot of times there's going to be just emergent belief structures that they could be kind of more secular or maybe new agey in nature or slightly culty. But absolutely, like I think the Amish people are a great example of one of the reasons that their legal structure essentially and their society is so functional and is growing in numbers and has been for a long time. It's because they're grounded in a faith, in a collective belief. And I don't think it has to be religious. I think historically this has been one version of this solution that's been very successful. And I think things like Christianity evolved and emerged because they served a function that was obviously very useful, if not at a certain point in our history, then continuing to this day. Like some people view these things as a mind virus that in no way helps us, and I don't think that's true. I think that these things, even in their imperfect form, were functional, and yeah, so I absolutely think that having belief structures to rally people, especially at the lower end, who are, yeah, that's basically what they're going to latch onto.
Yeah. And like often in a religious society, what you saw is like people at the low end are not kind of like what we've been discussing. Like people at the low end adhere without expecting to be part of the discussion.
Yeah,
Like if you were like, you know, a farmer, you weren't there like studying the theocracy and like being a big part of the discussion of what is right and wrong and what the right and wrong way to do it is, but you were very willing to go along with what you were told on Sunday and like normalize that cultural belief. And then like the scholarship happened within the church as well, and like people who really did have radical ideas like in a much smaller group debated them and disseminated them from the top down.
yeah, like apparently in early Jewish society, like they had a lot of emergent legal structure as well, and they very much did this where they would have legal authorities and or religious authorities that would try to move legal precedent in different ways and try to reconcile social customs with religious text. And
Absolutely.
it's fascinating for sure.
Yeah. I think like I would describe myself as very much like a constitutionalist. Like I like the idea of like a codified written document that defines the rules of our society that's sort of above the individuals that are underneath it. And like something like a religious text can very much fill that role and has historically. So can like something like the US Constitution or whatever. But like
Yeah.
having this idea of like, while you can debate the ideas of like what is meant here, like how should this apply, you can't really, you're past the fundamental debate of like, can you steal from people? Like, can you kill your neighbor? Like those are obviously wrong. When you get to a corner case, like can you shoot somebody who's trespassing on your property? Then you dig in and debate it a little bit more. But having an underlying framework that's sort of beyond questioning, as bad as it sounds, I think has a lot of positive effects for a society.
Yeah, no, I this is something that's discussed in this book as well, is that it studies the American Constitution, the Jewish legal system, and the Islamic legal system as three systems that were, if not based on, like the American Constitution isn't seen as religious, but it's often treated by legal scholars as if it is.
Yeah.
It's this kind of immovable object. And
Absolutely.
absolutely, it can be something that is much more functional and dependable because of its being viewed as derived from an immovable source. But at the same time, it's fascinating how when society shifts and evolves past the legal precedent and they're required to evolve the text, the different difficulties they're faced with evolving it.
Absolutely.
And in all these cases, legal scholars have found ways to evolve the text, usually through like linguistic manipulation, like the interstate commerce clause, and often ways that are not great, but it's always
for sure. Yeah. It's a flaw. Like, I think it's always important to acknowledge when we discuss government that it is an institution of people, and all of them will be flawed. There's no such thing as like the perfect government that has no problems. There's obvious problems with like a state, like an authoritarian state. There's obvious problems with democracy. There's obvious problems with communism, socialism, libertarianism, like, and that's like a good starting point. Because I often find that like people's discussion is just that. It's like, wow, like what about this one thing that sucks about your system? Like,
therefore, conversation over.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
like you know, because again, like it's all about the discourse is very focused on shutting down a discussion and like successful resolution, victorious resolution, rather than like actual like information.
Yeah, I do feel like I want to push back on a little bit of what you're saying, in that if we look at like an extreme case like the Somali system, they didn't have an established legislature, so they didn't have like even very firm rules about what, say, a human life is worth. There's general standards, but it's all based on a judge is picked based on if they're expected to apply a verdict that is going to satisfy the community, and if they don't do that, then they're not going to be picked in the future. And it's just literally an emergent thing where a judge's reputation is established because they've been successful in their verdict in the past. And in that case, the legal structure or the legal precedent is not even, it's not even concretized, it's not even established, let alone being placed above the people. And it still is very functional as long as there's a widely held belief in what the values of the society are and should be. So I do think it is possible to have a functional system without the legal uh, rules being placed above. But yeah.
Do you think there is like a natural or inherent like ebb and flow of power in society? Like if we look historically, there's sort of a trend that like you see like the birth of a new state and it begins to expand, or a state or a government or tribe or whatever you want to call it. Like we use different words in different contexts, but there's like a birth of power, and then like control and power grow and grow and grow until eventually like it becomes too much for it to self-sustain and it implodes. You have anarchy again, and then like new powers rise up. Do you think that's sort of like just natural? Like inevitably we're going to have like, because again, people talk about like what happens when like a corporation grabs too much of that judge or whatever, but maybe that's just part of how it works and how it works in every system. Like,
Yeah, I think there's a huge tendency in that direction where as we develop wealth, then we're able to afford more luxuries. And one of the luxuries we're able to afford is uh, certain things that I think promote the degradation of society. We're able to afford not working and not investing in our future. And I think at a certain point, the impetus for survival and for creating wealth goes away. And I think that's happening now in lots of ways. And I think just the cultural norms and the values and ethics that were necessary in the past for survival are no longer necessary now. And I think they start to
yeah,
dissipate in the end of society. And I think they kind of just, you devolve into a more of a hedonistic,
for sure.
just let's minimize suffering in the moment and kind of go off in one blaze of glory and a party kind of thing. That's kind of what I see is happening.
I think one like very natural, sort of logically easy trend that you see is that as societies become more affluent, people have less children.
Yeah.
And over time, that means that they are naturally supplanted by like these sort of up and coming groups that are reproducing on a massive rate. Like if you look at like the trend, sort of like if you're barely struggling to survive, you don't reproduce because like you don't have like the extra resources. Like if you're starving to death, you don't have children because that just is one more mouth to feed. And then when you reach like a certain level, you're like, okay, like on my farm, every child I have is going to be more prosperity for my group and my tribe. There's like room for upward mobility. And then you reach a point like kind of at the top of the bell curve where you start coming down again. And you're like, well, if I have 3 kids, that's going to be a big drain on my lifestyle. And they're going to take more from me than they give back. And people start having less. Like in our society, like a lot of Western societies are facing like a replacement crisis. Like people aren't having, 2 people don't have 2 children. And the only way we're sustaining our populations is through immigration. And, you know, somewhat naturally that will change our society as rapidly growing groups bring new ideas from other parts of the world.
Yeah. And I think the only kind of defense against the decline of a society would be when we just develop social norms and social precedents and cultural momentum against this. And I think we need to spread awareness that this does happen and defend against this. Like, for instance, I think there's a huge tendency right now to say, maybe rich people don't need to keep their money because, you know, they don't need it anymore. And we can just kind of basically take from the rich to give to the poor because it's more, we can afford this now because we're
like
not
quite literally, like you hear people discussing like eat the rich, right? Like just literally like destroy them and disseminate their resources.
And I think that's a very natural inclination that comes about through the progression of wealth that we've seen. And I think that's the kind of attitude that's going to lead to the destruction of this society. And I think if we don't address that and acknowledge that that society is self-destructive of itself, then it's going to happen. And I think we need to just shine a spotlight on that. And I think that's the only real defense we have against that kind of decline, honestly.
But don't you think like what you're describing is a somewhat natural thing? Like I think throughout history, like you saw stuff like that. Like it'd be like if you got one person who hoarded all the wealth for too long, like the peasants rise up or they get lynched in the middle of the night or whatever. Like in Vietnam, you saw this. Like you'd have like these really high-ranking officers that were just like shot in their bed in the middle of the night because like other people wanted to move up, and that's just sort of a natural thing that people do. Like I don't think it's necessarily bad. Like obviously I'm not advocating for like murder. Maybe I picked some bad examples there. Like, this sort of natural tendency for like, again, people like rise up, and then at a point we say, okay, that's too much, we're going to take it back.
Yeah.
And like that's just sort of a natural part of the game.
I've heard that referred to as tall poppy syndrome. Just the idea of people who grow too tall, we're going to cut them down.
Yeah.
And I do think that that is a very natural aspect of human nature because we value equality so much. And I think this value for equality can be misapplied. I do think, though, cultures can develop either an acceptance of that tendency, we can call it tall poppy syndrome, or
Sure.
like either they can develop an acceptance of it or a resentment or resistance to it. And I think American culture is especially traditional American culture, I think is a very good example of a culture that was very opposed to that type of idea. And this is one of the things I was going to save for the discussion, but the Somali society, they actually have one social norm that is rich people are required by custom, and a very defined and outlined, stipulated custom, when and how much money they need to give away when they become rich. And so this could be seen as a type of social insurance, or it can be seen as a incentive against wealth creation. But fundamentally, that's a social norm that was established that I think pretty much guarantees that Somali culture is never going to get that rich, and they're never going to develop in the way that the American economy did. They're never going to become the American society that's going to become imperialistic and powerful. They're never going to have a rise, essentially, is what I'm saying, because they have that precedent right now. They've institutionalized tall poppy syndrome. Whereas, so I don't think it's necessarily a natural thing that happens in all societies. I think we can have a precedent and a kind of a commonly held belief that it's not okay, even though we have this feeling that it's unjust. It's not okay to take people's property, but so I think it depends to a large degree on what culture is held.
I think though, like even in like okay, maybe we shouldn't like get super into this, but I'm just going to put up the idea that that is something that would naturally happen at a point in an emergent legal system. Is that as a society we would say like, collectively as a group, we're going to take this person's resources, and like the market is going to support that because that's what everybody wants. And it's like, it's not in every single conceivable scenario, it's not a bad thing, or it's not always a bad thing if you look at every possible scenario. Certainly, I'm not going to argue that like we should have lynch mobs in the street just taking people's money. But I think there is something to be said that like sometimes if there's too much wealth accumulation, especially if it is felt that it was done improperly or unfairly, that like having society take those resources back. And I also want to bring up that like in addition to the Somali thing, like both Christian and like all of the Abrahamic faiths really like place a high emphasis on tithing and this idea of like rich people putting their resources back into the community, and at least in theory it's supposed to trickle down and be distributed among the poor.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear, I have no issue with an emergent social order that establishes that as one of its norms. So as long as we can choose to therefore join, say, a group that has that as one of its practices, I just don't like the idea of it being an inherent thing. And I would push back against the idea that that would be an inherent part of any emergent society, because I think it would fully depend on the ideas held within the minds of the individual people who participate in that system. And if they
don't you just think that if it gets bad enough, like there's going to be a point of wealth inequality where everyone agrees this is too much and we got to swing it back the other way. Like in people's minds, I don't think you can fully convince people that if they're starving to death and one guy has all the money, that they shouldn't go and take it. Like, I just think that's a natural, it's always happened.
I think I agree that there's always going to be a line somewhere, but I think the line, for instance, in Somalia is very different than the line in especially 19th century America. So the line of how far can we cross before it's perceived as illegitimate wealth disparity. And I think So I do think that you could have societies that had much more acceptance of wealth creation or wealth disparity.
For sure. Do you think that wealth disparity is like tied intrinsically to wealth creation? That like allowing a certain amount, like we couldn't, do you reject fundamentally the idea of like us as a society creating wealth without an individual mandate? Like, does it necessarily have to be that one individual benefits? And I'm not necessarily espousing this opinion, but I'm asking if you think fundamentally that is crucial, or could we have an idea of like we're all going to move forward together, and like the disparity doesn't necessarily have to be part of it?
Yeah, well, I think the big wealth creation machine that I think we've seen operate in the last 200 years, I think relies on economic liberty. It allows people to have the freedom to create wealth in whatever way they see fit in their own little microcosm of the economy. And I think, and creating the ability to do what needs to be done to make their own wealth, and the right to keep it, providing the incentive to actually do it in the first place. I think those are necessary components of the wealth creation system we have. And so I think a necessary product of that is you're going to have people like John D. Rockefeller, who reduced the price of oil by, I don't know how many times over, to like 10% of its former cost, and made like a billion dollars. And I think that's a positive outcome of the society, or of the system.
Like, surely with Rockefeller in particular, you can acknowledge that it was done in many cases criminally. Like, he was pushing other actors out of the market. He was creating horizontal and vertical monopolies. Like, he was very much gaming the system and unfairly accumulating that wealth, which doesn't take away from the fact that it had positive benefits to society. But certainly, like, that was not a free and well operating market.
Well, actually, I mean, I'm choosing Rockefeller specifically because, like, the way he pushed people out of the market was he developed a new system of transporting oil in rail cars instead of barrels, for instance. He developed a lot of more different processes that are way more efficient, and basically by providing a product that was like 10 times or a tenth of the cost, he pushed people out of the market, but in a way that I don't see as improper or illegitimate. I think I see him as a hero who saved the whales.
I guess, like, and I'm going to admit that I can't like quote the exact details, but like for sure there was instances of him like buying up all the trucking and refusing to allow other companies access to that market. Like, move into a town, buy up all of a certain amount of infrastructure so that other people couldn't get their oil to market, and then like drive them out that way. Like, in a way that's not really, oh, I'm just offering a better product. He's like, I'm specifically targeting this industry, and because I'm the biggest player, I can strangle you and take your piece of it, and then force you to sell to me ultimately. Like, I think we can admit that there was some of that with Rockefeller in particular. I'm not going to say that it was certainly a mixed bag, and like, I'm not going to say that he was evil, but I think it must be acknowledged that there was like abuses of monopolistic power for Standard Oil.
Honestly, I know there was cases brought against them. Like there was lawsuits around. They were apparently forming a cartel and charging monopolistic prices. I do think the cases that were brought against them made no sense because the way they were charging those prices. I guess what I would ask you is I'm
acknowledging I can't be like, oh, like April 25th, like this company,
and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I would love, maybe later on you could maybe link me to like an article or something on him, because I think he has a very good history in his lifetime. I think his generations that came after him were more dubious, and they used lobbying in the pharmaceutical industry and whatnot to do dubious things. But during his lifetime, I think he played fair on the free market, created a better product, and changed the world. I think that's what I've seen. I would be very open to other evidence showing that, as you said,
I'll put some evidence together because I'm fairly certain that it exists.
Cool, that's fair.
But I won't belabor the point because I admittedly do not have it. like
But
to
anyway,
prove
yeah.
already.
So
Yeah.
so I, go ahead. Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
I guess we were just talking about the idea of um, whether or not disparity of wealth is an inherent part of wealth creation, and I think it is. I think that if you give people the right to create as much wealth as they can without being predatory in their local environment, some of them are going to be very successful at doing that, and hundreds, thousands, millions times even more, they're going to be a million times more successful than their neighbors sometimes. And I think that's just a natural consequence of, if you have a society that creates as much wealth as we have in the last 200 years, you're going to have way more wealth disparity than you have any other point in human history. And I think that's why,
Absolutely.
in principle, I'm not really against it, wealth disparity. I think it's just
I'm not against it, but again, I do think it is something that naturally corrects itself, and that's something we should. I don't think we need to fight against that curve, perhaps as hard as you would say we should. Like, I think there is a certain point naturally in any society, and this is why I think that it was, in Christian society, it was impressed upon these people, like, you got to give enough of it away that people aren't just going to take it, right? Like,
yeah,
there is a certain amount of like, if you look at like the amount of force that people can bring to bear, there is a point where a large group of poor people can just bring more force than a rich guy. Like, if you have a swarm of 1 million like peasants with pitchforks and torches, they can swarm the castle and kill
yeah,
the lord, and that's something that happened all the
yeah,
time. And I just think that's a natural part of humanity, and it happens in nature too. Like, if you have like an alpha wolf or a silverback gorilla or whatever that's perhaps getting too old and not able to provide for the community as much, and is like not stepping down and like giving someone else a shot, then like the tribe will take it from them.
yeah. And if I could just make a point in favor of what you're saying, I think, like, in addition to it just being a thing that we observe, I think
Yeah.
it could be argued that it is a functional thing that is important and should take place to
Yeah.
equal the balance of power in society. And I think there's really good evidence, as I'm kind of learning about in this book, that the Icelandic system, which was in place for more than 1,000 years, ended up becoming destabilized because of an imbalance of power, as wealth creation was accrued to individuals who could tax more.
Absolutely. And I just think like, yeah, like otherwise there's no incentive for them to disseminate that wealth. Like the incentive is like bread and circuses. You have to keep people happy enough that they aren't going to kill you, or else they'll kill you.
Yeah.
And that's like, part of how you buy that position in society is that you have to give a certain amount.
And
Interestingly, I wanted to bring up, are you familiar with the Republic of Virtue in Rome?
No.
So like, this is tying back to that thing we were talking about where people have less kids and live affluently and stuff like that. So like Augustus, when he rises to power, like acknowledges this problem and basically implements like a series of laws targeted at like rich, affluent people in his society. And he's like, literally by law, like you have to start having more kids, you have to like buy less expensive clothes and things like that, because they didn't have enough new generations to replenish the army. So he starts to like, through like force and mostly targeted at the upper echelons of his society, like say, yeah, everyone, like there was literally like minimum number of children. Like you have to have like 8 kids or whatever. Or if you have this much money, maybe you need to have 12 kids.
That's crazy.
Like it banned a lot of luxury items that they also felt were parts of the problem and things like that. Like it's very fascinating. A lot of people say that's the true end of democracy, because like it was sort of a crackdown on the high-ranking senatorial class of Rome.
That's wild. What was that called again? Sorry?
The Republic of Virtue.
The Republic of Virtue.
Usually what it's translated as. But yeah, it's kind of like a series of reforms. You can also hear it called the Octavian Reforms. But yeah, it's pretty interesting shit.
Yeah, that is, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I was going to say one more point in response to what you were saying. I think another way in which the wealth of society can be disseminated the wealth of the rich can be disseminated into society is through the natural overturning of rich people as they lose their money, as they often do. Like as you get higher in the economic brackets, the chances you're going to lose your wealth are higher. And the chances that you will leave those brackets are higher.
Do you really think that's true though?
Well,
Like,
according to people like Thomas Sowell, who I am very much a fan of, it is.
The idea of like downward mobility is essentially what you're describing. Like this idea that like as you get closer to the top, you have more chances to sink. Yeah. But I don't think you see a lot of people who are born into extreme wealth, or not. I shouldn't say born in, because I do think generationally you see what you're describing. I don't think you see a lot of people who build a $1 billion fortune by 40 and then lose it all by the time they're 70. Like, certainly you'll see people who go from who lose half of it, but I don't think you really see people who like move rapidly down the class divide in their lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have like the numbers in front of me.
Like, I don't think you could name like a prominent example that people would be familiar with.
Oh, that's the thing, whether or not they'd be familiar with it. But you can talk about a lot of just billionaires who were connected to failing industries in the later 20th century, is like people who were involved in film cameras lost their fortunes. Yeah. People who were involved in lots of these industries that switched over.
I fully acknowledge that, but when we say lost their fortunes, it's not like they're working at McDonald's now. Like, their industry died and they probably cashed out with a golden parachute of tens of millions of dollars and lived a quiet middle class life. But like, I don't think you're going to see like, the old tired stereotype of there's the hooded homeless guy in the corner that was like the CEO of McDonald's 10 years ago. Like, that just doesn't happen, I don't think. It's too easy for those people to hang on to enough wealth.
Yeah, I do think that's true. But I think the reason we're bringing this up is I'm questioning the idea that the majority of this wealth won't be reintroduced back into the system through natural means. And I think it might be true that the majority of them hold on to a part of their wealth that distances themselves from the average population. Like, they're still very rich by our standards. Maybe. Yeah. And I don't know if that's true. I do think it probably still happens that people, through addiction, gambling, bad divorces, all these bad choices that culminate later in life, for certain people, it leaves certain people who were billionaires in the gutter. I certainly believe that happens.
I just question, again, I agree with all that. I don't think they're in the gutter. Like, you look at like the worst cases I can think of are like people like Brendan Fraser and Nicolas Cage, who lost like gobs and gobs of money in their divorce and like ruined their careers and stuff like that. But like, still, they are multimillionaires. Like, Mel Gibson is a multimillionaire, and he's gone through like the fucking worst shit that could happen to you. Like, it's so hard to lose that amount of money.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm asking is, I'm not sure if it's necessary for any of the points that we're making to confirm that they don't lose all of their money, as long as the majority of the wealth. What I'm saying is, I think liquidity still exists in this economy, as long as the majority of wealth is liquidated out of their possession and back into the economy through their poor choices.
So here's what I would put to you, I guess. And admittedly, this is more of like a discussion point than like a rhetorical question. But when that happens, do you think most of that wealth is redistributed to lower classes, or do you think it's redistributed to another multimillionaire? Like, when Fujifilm goes out of business, where do you think all of their capital goes?
I suppose when they're investing in certain markets, they're going to be investing in production, they're going to be investing in advertisements, and all the various things that they invest in. Those won't be returned upon. Those investments will just kind of be made, and then they'll lose that money. So I suppose yeah, I think a lot of that money would be dissolved into various parts of the economy. Like, say they open up a factory in Taiwan and they start producing a bunch of fat cameras, and they don't get a return on investment because they don't get those cameras sold. Ultimately, that money is going to
another billionaire that owned the camera parts. Like, I don't know. I just question. I'm always skeptical of money filtering down. Like, I don't really think it's a lot easier for money to filter back up. Like, I think a lot of the capital of Fujifilm went to investors who cashed out. A lot of people who owned huge chunks of it cashed out at a loss, but still took their $35 million worth with them. And maybe they lost 15 million of that value. but a lot of that is still going back to wealthy capitalists. Like some of it, you're right, is going to like large contractors who didn't have to deliver and things like that. But even physical assets, like something like the building, like they built a factory in Taiwan, that's going to be bought by another millionaire. Like that money is not going. There's not some poor sweatshop worker who's like, I've got the better camera, I'm going to buy all this. Like, I just feel like it ultimately stays. There's not a lot of class mobility of funds. It's very rare to see, like Fujifilm disseminated $60 million to its employees and its consumers. It disseminates it to wealthy people at the same level.
I suppose even if this is the case, and I don't disagree with what you're saying, I think it's like accurate representation of reality. I still don't see it as a inherently bad thing, because if one billionaire acquires all the infrastructure and capital of Fujifilms, that doesn't prevent poor people from still creating wealth in their own independent economy. And I think
absolutely
fundamentally, because wealth can be created independent of wealth hoarding, I don't see either wealth hoarding or disparity of wealth as a barrier.
I guess I
progress.
see like I assume you're familiar with like social contract, right? Like
Yeah.
so like I think the social contract between wealthy people and poor people is that wealthy people will disseminate a certain amount of wealth downwards. Like the idea, like you're saying, like I am a billionaire, I can make more money than you guys can. I can create more for the economy than the people at the bottom can, provided the people under me give me the stability and security and safety that I need to do that. So if there's rioting in the streets, I can't sell cameras. Like that's not going to work. If people are looting my stores and things like that, I can't make enough money. So I'm going to make a deal with you guys that I'll push down enough wealth to make it worth your while. And in return, you will create a safe, secure system for me to make more wealth for all of us. And if you have a billionaire who isn't pushing the wealth down, who isn't fulfilling their side of that contract, there's no reason there's no incentive for the people at the bottom to respect that wealth, to allow them to do that. And I think when you have a case like that, it is the wealthy person who is violating the social contract and that they deserve to face the consequences. And it's perhaps unfortunate that it is not more codified. Like it would be great if you could say, like we used to, that you got to do 10% a year. Like that's the number. Push down 10%, give it away, pay it out as wages, however you want to do it. Like you've got to give back a certain amount to society and we'll let you operate. But if they don't do that, then I don't see what would or should stop people at the bottom from saying, okay, this is a bad deal. We're not signing this contract anymore. Like, what will happen will happen. Like, this is no longer an advantageous agreement for the people involved.
I guess I think I fundamentally disagree on the nature of that relationship. I think more what's happening is, let's say, we could even just use maybe like a pop star to take it out of the case of business. So it seems maybe a little bit more like just individuals interacting. Let's say Katy Perry is putting on a massive studio concert tour, and she needs to hire like 1,000 roadies and techs and lighting assistants and all these different people, and they're all gonna have a bidding war and figure out what are the fair wages based on the number of people who can provide those jobs and all the different things, and eventually they're going to arrive at an understanding of what's kind of fair between those two, what they perceive as fair. And to me, that's not at all payments that's not pushing wealth down. That's saying, okay, what do we agree on as like a contract of what's fair for what is the service that you're providing? What's the market rate for that service? And whether or not Katy Perry has $1 million or $1 billion doesn't really affect the nature of that interaction. Granted, it could be a new social precedent that we have this as a rule that if you are Katy Perry and you're worth $1 billion, then you are required, if you're putting on a concert, to give this much money to people, blah, blah,
But
whatever. But
so like certainly you would agree that there needs to be some sort of underlying agreement that we're going to respect each other's property, right? Like that's the basis of a market system, that like we are going to come to an agreement as a society in a binding way that we're going to respect each other's property. And like part of that agreement, I think, has to be that property is not being used like nefariously against people. Like the same way we would say if you use your $1 million to build a cannon on your roof and start shooting it into the crowd, eventually we're going to come and dismantle that because it's an irresponsible use of your capital that is harming society, that isn't the deal we signed up for, even though you're using it like it's your property and you're using it as you see fit. Like that's a deal, that's not the deal we made. And I think this is the same way. Like we can say, okay, like you can have 500 grand and buy yourself a boat and things like that. When you start to have billions and billions, we want something in return, or else we're going to consider that an invalid use of property.
can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So in this case, the threat or the danger that this poses to society, is that danger the very fact that people will riot and create chaos in order to take what's perceived as theirs?
I don't think it's necessarily, I see it more as like preconceived terms than a threat. Like
A
I
social
think we are
contract.
saying that we will not, like we are offering, if you look at like, if you consider it as classes bargaining with one another, which is a very Marxist concept, I'll admit, but like, let's look at it that way for a second. You have people at the bottom that are saying, what we can offer you is a safe and stable place to do business. Like there's so many of us and we don't have a lot of resources, but we have a lot of violence. That is really what we've monopolized in this market. Like we can bring an order of magnitude more violence than the people at the top. And that's what we bring to bear. And in exchange for us using our violence responsibly in a way that won't negatively impact you, in a way that is best for everyone, you need to use your wealth the same way, in a way that is best for everyone. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give all of it away, because then the people at the top will say there's nothing in it for us. But you have to give enough of it away that people feel like they're getting a good deal. And if people don't feel like they're getting a good deal, why should they give you the stable, secure environment in return if they don't feel like they're getting a good deal? If you're not fulfilling that end of the contract, why should they follow through on theirs? Unless it's just a demand. If it's a demand that rich people are demanding that poor people behave in a certain way, regardless of how much we give them in return, that's a very different question. But
I guess I'm wondering how what you're describing is any different than extortion.
well, I guess maybe it depends on what you see the natural state of humanity. Like I would say naturally humans are like animals and everyone is out there taking what they can. You don't have like this agreement among wolves that we're going to let this wolf chop down all the trees and in return, like whatever, like wolves just kill whatever. And there's no real rules other than very small social units that like impose order through a largely authoritarian system. And if we want to have like a different deal than that, then it's a bargain. We're going to say like, we're going to move away from the natural state is violence, I guess, is my claim. And if you want more than that, if you want people to not do that and not take what they can as they naturally would, then you need to give them an incentive to not behave that way.
See, I think the way for us to pull ourselves out of that state of nature where it's just barbarism is to put in place these universalized legal precedents that apply to everyone. Like you can't steal,
Absolutely.
you can't hurt and kill. But I think if the class of poor people are going to pursue a policy like this, then it's going to be very difficult for them to say, we believe that extortion is wrong in a universal sense. They can no longer believe that that's a law in society if they are going to pursue that against rich people. And that's, I think, things break down.
What makes stealing inherently less moral than hoarding, for example? Like,
Well, I
what
think
makes it more acceptable to hoard resources from people who need them versus steal resources from people that don't need them? I don't think that's like an inherently, like, I think all of these things have to be agreed by everyone. Like, it's a contract we're all entering into. And I don't think that like it's unreasonable or unfair to say like people with capital have to bring something to the table.
well, I
The
think
deal can't just be that we're going to operate however we want, and people, all the things we need from society must be promised, but the things society needs from us will be freely given.
I think the difference between the two would be the difference between, like, say there's an Amish community who, like German Amish communities have a very strong history of being very efficient farmers, or just German
Yeah,
people in general.
absolutely.
German farmers have a huge history of their farms would produce way more product than whatever farms they were situated next to.
Yeah.
Let's say there's like a German Amish community that just exists by in their sense of things. They believe they're independent. They believe they're their own unit, and they're creating wealth. They're creating farms
Yeah.
and capital, and they're way more wealthy than the surrounding area. Creating that wealth and having way more wealth than everyone else, and depending on how you look at that, that could be perceived as hoarding. That is very different than going to people and taking what is theirs. Like, say some poor people created some food and they're, have enough to get by, and coming and taking that is, or taking from the Amish, I think is fundamentally different than creating or hoarding wealth.
But like in the Amish community, they absolutely have norms that you have to give back to the community. Like, it is not acceptable in Amish society to say, I'm going to be the Amish millionaire and fuck the rest of you. Like, it is very much a communal society.
But they're not required to give money to outsiders, which is a key difference.
No, absolutely. But they
But
are required to give money to the community and participate in communal activities.
Yeah, but
like,
whether
they're
or not
giving labor perhaps more than capital, but that's the same.
But
Like,
whether or not someone is perceived as an outsider is a lot of time a matter of perspective. So I might consider myself and my family to be independent actors in this community, and we have created this wealth. But the poor people who live around my village perceive, oh, no, you're part of our community, and you're required, if you're going to live here and exist in this area. And Amish people trade with the outsiders. They still trade, and they still hire cab services to take them long distances. There's still lots of ways in which Amish people interact and trade with the outsiders, so they're not completely isolated. And I think, so I guess what would you say to that then?
I guess I'm saying, like, I think the Amish have done exactly what I've described. Like, there is a contract, a social contract. Like, certainly it's different, but if you look at them within their society, I think it's very fair to say there's a contract that says, like, you can be a little bit better off than the guy next to you. There's certainly room to be like a more successful farmer. You have more cheese, you have a more beautiful wife, like whatever. But like, they don't accept as a society that you would just like, buy all the wells in town and become like a millionaire that way. Like, there are norms that say like you have to give away a certain amount. You have to give back to the community a certain amount, or we're not going to allow you to participate in this community. And I don't think they would say, okay, if you're going to leave this community, we're going to let you take all of your wealth with you. I think they'd often say like, okay, like this barn that you have, we all built it together, we're keeping it. Like, these tools that people made for you. Like, when people do like the Rumspringa or leave the community, they leave everything behind.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. But in that case, I think that's not a social contract that you sign up for implicitly by being part of a society. That's a series of ordinances that you agree to explicitly when you come of age or when you join the community as part of a vow. So I think in
Well,
that sense, it's very different. And I agree that that's okay. But I think I would maintain that I think it is the rights of rich Amish people to not give wealth to outsiders. And there's no implicit social contract between all of Canadians, for instance, that they're
no,
required
sure.
to show their wealth.
I guess I would just say I think there is an implicit contract. Like, I think people naturally realize, and I think if you talk to wealthy people, especially wealthy people in less established states. So if you went and talked to a millionaire in Somalia or in Mongolia or something like that, there's absolutely the attitude of like, there needs to be a certain amount of wealth dissemination or people will just take what you have. Like, and I think that is a natural part of the deal. And I think people here get a very good deal, so we have a lot more tolerance. Like even somebody like Jeff Bezos, where like Jeff Bezos is like, we still are pretty good off, even though like there's huge wealth disparity. People here are very happy. There is a lot of money coming down to the bottom. But if you had like 300 million Americans starving to death, absolutely they would take the like property of the rich. They would go and burn down their houses and loot them and redistribute that wealth. And I think that is a very natural part of human society. And if wealthy people don't realize that, then that's the problem. Like,
I do think there's a counterbalance to what you're saying, where I think one of the reasons we're so well off in our society and we have so much more wealth is because we have been so, we've put millionaires in such a long leash where we've allowed them to create so much wealth. We've had not a lot of this tall poppy syndrome. And I think that's kind of goes hand in hand to a degree as well. But I do agree that this is a natural part of human nature, and it's probably very hard to avoid.
Though, like in the historical context, we tax and redistribute more wealth than we ever have before in history. Like the ideas of like even like free education. Like I know the U.S. doesn't have free healthcare, but like here we have free healthcare. Most modern states have some form of free publicly offered education. Most modern states have police, fire departments, like things like that. Like there is a lot being pushed down, but you hear rich people start saying like, why am I giving anything? Like when someone like Jeff Bezos feels like he shouldn't pay any taxes, I think there's a very natural reaction to say, if you're not going to, we offer you the opportunity to give enough in the way you see fit. And if you're not going to do that and you're going to violate this social contract, then leave or face like the consequences.
Yeah, I think this might be a case where we have a slight disagreement on what would be the most ideal social arrangement, but that's kind of okay. I mean,
for sure.
Maybe in
I'm using extreme language, but like what would practically happen often, like something you see that happens in our system all the time is you'll see like a gigantic class action settlement against a large company. Like cigarette companies, for example, you see like eventually people are like, you've done so much damage to this society that you're going to pay out like some inordinate amount of money, $500 million to all these people who are sick or whatever. And like that you see in our society a lot. It happened against auto companies back in the 40s and 50s. Like that is like perhaps a less violent mechanism by which it takes place in our society. But I think it's much the same thing. Like, but certainly if like the attitude of a rich person is like, I am going to violently defend my property from redistribution, then I think at a point people will say, well, we're going to make it happen anyway.
Yeah, like, no, and I don't disagree. And I think there's going to be lots of, if I have my way and we have more of a decentralized emergent societies, there's going to be lots of societies that kind of draw the line at a different point. Maybe people will draw the line very close to like at very small amounts of wealth creation, and maybe it's very large amounts.
And like, I don't claim to know like what the exact number is, but even in that system, like if you have, like, let's say you have a society of 100 million people and one guy has all the wealth, absolutely in that emergent system, you're going to have people band together and say, this company is going to go take money from that guy. Like, I think you have that in an emergent market too. It's just a natural part of how the system has to work. And what would happen is, in a perfect world, that guy would see that incentive and say, okay, I'd rather pay 8% a year and like keep everybody pacified than lose it all to a violent mob. And I just think that's a natural part of the system. I think that's part of the deal.
I think for most societies that would be the case. I think certain societies might come to the belief that in order to better incentivize wealth creation over the long term, we're going to allow more hoarding. And I think that's just going to be a subjective line that people draw at different points. And
for sure. But I don't think people would just allow an infinite amount of hoarding.
I would.
You would?
I would.
Like, I just don't think you would. Like, if you were starving to death and you needed to steal to feed yourself, I think you would. I think anybody would.
Yeah, but that's very different than, like, a pragmatic consideration in a time of starving to death. It's very different than, I believe in principle, if I have the choice between taking money from the richest person in the world who has $1 trillion and going to mow some lawns for the afternoon and make $60, I'm going to choose the $60 every time.
Absolutely. I
And
agree.
that's what I mean. There's no circumstance in which I would choose stealing over the possibility of legitimately owning or working for my own money, if that's a possibility. And it's
I guess
and
like maybe I see myself as more radical than that. Like I
that's
think if
okay.
I like to imagine myself as the guy on the plantation who would have been like, enough of this shit. Like
This is bullshit. Yeah, that's fair.
that's like that is actually, I should have used that as a less controversial example. Like slave uprisings were a hugely common thing, and like people on like even in that situation where like people had the legal right to own slaves and treat them however they wanted, like effectively you don't treat them like garbage, because you know if you
Yeah,
push down enough they're going to rise up against you. So there is a certain amount of, if I give them a nice place to live, if I'm nice to them, if I allow them a certain amount of freedom in return, they won't kill me.
yeah,
And like,
absolutely.
I just think that's, yeah, I think certainly that's a different scenario, but I think it highlights that even in that extreme case, like that's always part of the bargain.
I agree. Or at least it's always part of what rich people need to worry about or should be worried about if they're going to be
Yeah.
practically maintaining
I
their
think
wealth.
it should be part of your analysis. Like,
Yeah, if you're
and whether you
reasonable, I
want to
agree.
describe that as a tax, or I think in a lot of cases it's like freely given wealth. Like I look like someone, look at the difference between how Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos are viewed. And a big part of the difference is like the Melinda Gates Foundation, like just huge disseminations of massive amounts of wealth. People are forgiving of the fact that Bill Gates is one of the richest people in history because he gave so much of it away. And so
Yeah,
he gets a pass. Whereas Jeff Bezos, I feel, is seen as not giving a lot back to the community and is seen very negatively as a result of that. And, you know, is increasingly like the target of a lot of these protests and stuff in the United States. Like, you hear a lot of people on the left, like specifically targeting Jeff Bezos as somebody who needs to distribute more wealth. And I think he should weigh that, you know?
yeah, that's fair.
Although I see what you're saying, that like, well, it does happen, perhaps it's not ideal, I think is kind of how I would characterize your case. Like, if we
Yeah.
could make that not happen, it might be better.
And I think for the practical long term, for the benefit of all, it creates more wealth creation over time. I think if we allow um, what is perceived as hoarding, because I mean, the wealth we have today is the wealth that only the richest kings would have 200 years ago, and the wealth we
Absolutely.
have today is only created, I think, through these in principle property rights that allow hoarding of wealth. So I think much in the same way we demonize Jeff Bezos today, we would have been demonized 200 years ago. And I think if we maybe are lax in the rules, maybe one day we can all be Jeff Bezos. I don't
Couldn't you
know.
make the argument, though, that the cause and effect is the other way around? That because we have given people such a high standard of living, people are more tolerant of extreme wealth creation in our society because people have such a good deal. Whereas I think people would be much less accepting of it if they were living like serfs in a modern society. Like, I would ask you to consider that the cause and effect is the other way around. That we've given people a really good deal here. We've disseminated a lot of wealth. We pay more in taxes and get more in public services than we ever have at any point in history. And that makes people less likely to get upset when somebody is a trillionaire. That
Yeah,
makes people more accepting of, I am still getting a good deal. So this guy's still pushing enough down. I'm making enough in wages and government subsidies and whatever else that I have a pretty comfortable lifestyle.
yeah, I absolutely think the relationship probably goes both ways, in which we are more accepting for the reasons you describe.
Yeah,
However, I do think it's worth coming back to what do we know about what facilitates wealth creation. And I think when we kind of come back to that perspective, I think we should acknowledge the role that, yeah, just in principle property rights and consistent rule of law play. And
absolutely.
yeah,
No, like I acknowledge all of that. I just think like that is really what the lower classes bring to the table, is all of those things that help, right? Like you could view it in a way that lower class people have created a system in which billionaires can flourish. And I just don't think that it's unfair for them to accept something in return.
yeah, well, I mean, that kind of sounds like the mob creates a situation where businesses can operate by not burning down their property, and they're not really
Well,
creating it by not initiating violence.
it's like again, I guess it depends on your view of the natural state of humanity, but I think like it is they are giving something up by saying I'm not going to eat fruit from every tree. Like I'm not going to hunt animals in every field. Like we're going to agree to like a system that allows wealth creation, but we're not going to agree to it if there's no benefit for people at the bottom. Like we expect a certain amount in exchange for like creating the system that works. Because naturally, people would. The reason that monkeys can't make a farm is because other monkeys don't agree to that. They say, "Fuck that! I'm going to eat all the fruit I can find," and so they don't bother planting things. They don't bother like building structures because someone else will just move in. Like you
I
do
don't
need a deal there to make that happen.
I don't think it's necessarily true that in a raw state of nature you'd have access to every fruit on the trees, because there would be other individuals who would make claim with probably violent territorial warfare on that. Because
Well, for sure.
if there's no explicit property rights, there's going to be informal property rights enforced through violence,
I
which is
guess
what we
like yeah,
see.
what you're highlighting and I would agree with is that like in nature it's all about enforcement. Like what you own is purely the things you can violently prevent other people from having.
Yeah,
And like if you can't like you can't be in every place at once. So if you're going to say this is my tree and I'm going to knock down every monkey that climbs up, then you can't at the same time be across the river in that other tree and be knocking them out of that one too, right? Like
and I also like how in our system, if we're a really really weak monkey who can't beat up other monkeys for fruit, then we can just go to work and shine shoes and make enough fruit for
yeah.
eating. This is a really weird analogy. I'm crossing things over.
No, I get what you mean though. That like it is a nice thing of our system that like the most violent don't have the most power necessarily. And in fact, I would say that is like very extremely not the case in our modern society, that violent people have almost no additional influence over nonviolent people.
Yeah, and I think it's a huge benefit and superiority that it's not the case that might makes right. And I think it almost sounds to me that what you're describing when you describe the lower classes having the ability to do this, you're almost saying, well, this is just a natural thing that can do this. But I very much question whether or not they should be doing this. And I
I
think the
guess
social precedents against it, I think, are very functional for a
all I
reason.
would say is that like I think there are winners and losers. Like there are certainly people who would do better in like an unstable system, and you do see this like when you have like cases like 19th century Sicily, or many would argue like New York, Los Angeles, like Las Vegas, where like there's a power vacuum, and you have like powerful gang leaders or cartels or whatever you want to call them rise up and fill that niche, and they do much better in that system than they were doing in like lawful society where
Yeah,
they were a factory worker, right?
totally.
And so if you want those people to give up those things they could have, you can't offer them nothing in return. Like that's not a fair bargain.
Yeah, especially those people. Yeah.
And well, but anybody, right? So like if you're going to take that away from them, you have to give them something in return, or else it's just like you have like an ironic authoritarianism of the free market where it's like, no, like you can't do the things that would be most beneficial to you. You're going to say in return for not doing the thing that is most beneficial to you and picking something that's more beneficial for everyone, we're going to give you some benefits too, right? In the form of disseminated wealth.
I guess I see the trade-off is different, because I see, regardless, moving to more of a free market system based on exchange, nonviolent exchange, and like a standardized legal framework, I think
Yeah.
creates wealth for everyone over time. I don't think it creates wealth disparity where rich people grow richer faster than everyone else. But I think
No, absolutely.
even with the right to hoard excessive amounts of wealth, I think that's just going to be better than the alternative. So I don't think it's true that we're coming to people and saying, you're in a good situation now, we're going to switch to this new system, but we need to offer you something in exchange. I think we are, if we offer them just capitalism in any form, really. I think it
Yeah.
might be, as I say, I am open to an emergent social precedent that says that you need to give away a certain percentage, as long as it's an emergent thing.
Well, I like ultimately what I'm describing is an emergent behavior. Like I don't think you'd ever have a law that says you can't have more than this amount of money, or you can't have 80% more money than the next guy. But like, I just think there's an emergent natural thing that as the amount of wealth you hold outstrips your power to protect it, there will be an emergent like drive for people to just take it. And if you don't want that to happen, and we both agree that's a bad situation, but I guess I would say that the right way to solve that problem is to say, I'm going to spread a certain amount of this around, and in return, you guys are going to agree not to steal it.
Yeah.
Like, and I believe, without knowing like a monkey that first came up with the idea, that that's sort of how it emerged in the first place. Like the idea of property rights said, okay, this guy's really good at chopping down trees. This guy's really good at making arrows, whatever. Like, we're going to respect this idea with the caveat that they're not just going to like disproportionately control our entire tribe through the creation of that wealth. Like,
yeah. And I guess as long as it's a thing that, I guess my only worry, and this is probably an irrational worry, is that there would be an emergent culture that would view it as there's no one on the planet that has the right to this much wealth. It's one thing to say no one in my community can grow this much wealth, and that's I think pretty defensible. But the idea of just no one on planet Earth can, even someone like in a country away who's like has a totally different arrangement with people, and maybe for them it's best for everyone involved. For me to say I don't think he deserves all that wealth a world away and I have a claim to it, I think is very indefensible. But
I agree. Like, I want to be clear. Like, I'm totally against like the attitude that's just like, like why we could just distribute all of Jeff Bezos's wealth and it would make everyone so rich. And you're like, yeah, but like really even the short-term effect of that would be very negative for most people in our society, right?
Yeah.
And like, I agree with all that. I just think like, like people need to be a little bit afraid, or else like you're just going to have people who will break all of the rules because they can. And like, especially if you have a system that prevents or that protects them as they do so.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Yeah. And I agree with the vast majority of what you're saying. I'm just trying to like.
No, I understand. Sure I play devil's advocate too.
Yeah.
But like, I think like, and I wouldn't say that we necessarily are in a bad spot in our society. Like, I think the rhetoric is bad, but the actual action hasn't gotten there yet. Like, you don't actually see examples of people like lynching billionaires in America.
For sure.
As much as people talk about it.
Yeah.
Like, they don't do it.
But usually the emergence of the kind of the culture and the widespread belief is the precursor to the action. And so I do think it's, but I don't know.
I wonder often what would happen if someone did. Like, let's say you have one crazy mentally ill guy who like shoots Jeff Bezos. Like, what would happen? What would the reaction of our society be?
That's a good question. I would like to think not like boiling over into anything crazy.
Yeah, like I think you'd have like, and all that wealth, right? Because that's now going to go to, it's almost like a succession crisis. There, well, I mean, right? Like you'd have, okay, there's $1 trillion worth of Amazon to get distributed among whoever. Like,
yeah, well, I'm sure there'd just be a new CEO appointed. Like, it's not like that's in his personal bank account. It would just be a new.
But like, even on the board, like with that much money, I just think you'd see crazy shit. Like,
probably,
I think it would be very similar to when you see like kings assassinated in history, and like certainly like there was always a system there too. That's like, well, we all know that it's supposed to be this guy, but there'll be other people who are like, oh, like I'm the long lost cousin who was off in France. Like, this is my shit. Like, I'm showing up with an army, fight me. Like,
I would be fascinated to see on the inside of what took place in such a company when that happened. I have no doubt it would be very insane.
It'd be pretty wild.
Yeah, I feel like that, I actually really like what we ended up talking about today. I thought that was an interesting little.
Yeah.
I feel there's a few different things, but that was cool. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add. I feel like we're reaching a good time here.
Yeah, I feel like we're reaching a good conclusion. Do you want to like summarize your case? Do you want to go first, or should I go first? Last time you got the last word.
There you go. I go first this time. Absolutely. Yeah, no, my case would just be that, well, I think an emergent social precedent that would require the distribution of wealth is totally legitimate. I think that it should be caution. We should caution people to remember that the foundations of wealth creation include the respect for private property, and there needs to be consideration for that.
For sure. I think that's fair. I think that it's important to note. I think it's important to say that a billionaire can't just run away from society after they've already become successful. That there is some amount of you owe people for how you got there. And this idea of I'm going to become a billionaire and then no longer be part of this community that wants to control a piece of that wealth shouldn't be allowed. And there needs to be a way of preventing that from happening, or else wealth will just continually leave communities.
I feel like I might want to respond to that, but I respect the last word. That's so funny.
I give you time to briefly respond to that.
No. I feel like yeah. No, we could talk.
Ruminate on it all week.
No, that's a fine place to end it.
Yeah.
It's so funny. It's so funny, the idea of the last word, because it's like, if I could just add one, no.
I know.
Because you could always keep on going back and forth forever.
This conversation has been going on for 5,000 years.
And if I could just add one more last word to your...
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
I do think we should talk about, do you want to do emergent, market law and emergent legal systems next week? Or do you want to have another quick one? Or
I would like to have emergent law next week. I think I'll probably be prepared by then. I thought I'd be prepared by this week, but then I'm like, I knew, like, by the end of the week, I'm like, okay, I can get through this book. I think I can do this. And I'm like, why am I rushing? There's no point.
Totally.
So
I know when you like read really fast, you're like, I didn't absorb any of that.
Yeah.
Like, just
so
scanning from left to right as fast as I could.
Yeah, and I also want to like listen to it at least twice. So I want to have it like,
yeah,
very much in my.
It sounds like you want to have a discussion of like real examples and alternatives and pros and cons. Like,
yeah, and what I really like about the David Friedman account is that he really explores the how feudal systems fail and the different examples of when they've failed. And like the Iceland example, he looks at how it came apart. He doesn't see them as, oh, these anarchic legal systems are like perfect and pure and cannot be undermined. He's like, oh, they all have problems and they all have different problems that have different solutions. And I'd love to just talk about the different problems that they have.
Absolutely. I really enjoy, I think one of the problems with discussions of libertarianism and like communism and socialism on the other side is that like, it's very tempting to discuss them in this pure theoretical space where like every example is bad and you can just talk about like pure versions. Like, it's like, you actually look at examples of systems, of any system, it almost always fails catastrophically, whether it's democracy or communism or anarchy or libertarianism or anything. And it's very tempting to say, wow, in the pure like microcosm I'd like to think about, it's perfect and never fails.
It's like, perfect in my head.
Yeah. And like we've said before, like it's very tempting to be like, wow, that was, the true Scotsman argument. Like that wasn't real communism. That wasn't real libertarianism. So like actually having a discussion grounded in like, here are real examples, here are the good things that happened, here are the bad things that happened, I think would be a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs, I think.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say only problems.
Oh, no.